So, hello world. How's everybody doing out there? Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you are across the seven continents and the seven seas. And today we have an awesome guest that goes by the name of Chris. How you doing, Chris?
I'm doing well. How about yourself?
I'm doing pretty well, man. Just so everybody knows, Chris Linkenbach is the founder of C. Linky Studios, a private photo/video production company. And he also manages the YouTube channel Woke and Waking Up, which is how I found you, Chris. And I really very much appreciate it. And just so the audience gets a little bit extra, Woke and Waking Up is a medium used to spread information about the benefits of meditation and general philosophy about the universe. He accomplishes this in the forms of videos such as his podcast like Lightroom Chats, where he edits photos while simultaneously discussing philosophy and spirituality. He also has started a series of videos entitled Let's Meditate, which are a variety of guided meditations. And Chris, that's how honestly I found you, man, and I very much appreciate it because I'm very into meditation, and this is the first time I've ever had someone on the platform talking about meditation, and it's just a pure honor, man. How you doing?
I'm doing so well. I'm happy to be here, man. It's such an honor. It really is.
Oh, please, man. And so, Chris, just to leave off on our awesome conversation from last time, you know, I told you my mentor is Sadhguru, but honestly, I skipped a part there. Why don't you tell the audience about yourself in your
Yeah.
own words without the introduction, of course?
Well, you know, I am I guess the main thing is I don't believe people should fit into boxes, right? I don't think that someone should be labeled as a certain identity in a way. I think we should start removing ourselves from these kind of systems, but I I would consider myself somebody who is somewhat spiritual, and I don't like that term per se because it comes with a lot of baggage today. It comes with this new age vibe. It comes with this crystal loving, energy feeling kind of woo woo sense, and I think that that kind of deters a lot of people away from that. And what I really think that it is at the end of the day is it is sort of just this curiosity about the universe. It isn't, a sense of spirituality, even though that's what I would consider it. It's more so just a sense of deep curiosity I have about the universe and this deep craving I have to just understand. And there's this giant hole inside of me that just wants to know information, know about why we're here, what we're doing, what this is all about, And I think that we as a society have really lost touch of this curiosity, this sacredness for the universe. And I have, noticed a couple things in my life that have kind of just led me down a certain path and have originally, brought me into this topic of meditation. And I think that being called a meditator is something that is also put into a box. And I think that meditation is also something that we have developed so many different conceptual ideas around and so many different constructs. I think meditation has so many different uses and benefits. And I would, it's interesting to talk about because not only is meditation something that you can use to just kind of like calm yourself down, but it's also something you can use to release previous traumas. It's something you can use to set intentions. It's something you can use to just connect with yourself. It isn't necessarily just about calming your mind down, even though that's one of the huge benefits of it. It has so much more potential, even for some spiritual masters, it allows you to literally leave your body. I unfortunately haven't really been able to do it, but there is astral travel. There is, dreaming, lucid dreaming. There's different things you can do with our state of consciousness, and I think meditation is a gateway into these doors, these abilities. So yeah.
Man, you have stumbled upon the right podcast, and thank you for accepting this invitation because just so the audience out there, what's up, audience? I'm sorry I didn't say hi in the beginning, and if I did, obviously I got so into what Chris was saying that Chris, I honestly, as you can see in front of me, and I'll even show the audience if they're watching this through YouTube, or if not, there's two pieces of paper I'm holding up full of notes that I took just for this podcast for you, but I don't even have to look at the notes to begin. And I'm loving what you're saying. And it's a natural human tendency, Chris, to deconstruct, to create boxes. It's a natural human tendency to create boxes. It's a natural human tendency to create boxes because it helps us understand the world. It helps us, for example, um, all dogs look like this. A dog is a box. It's a word, but it's a box. It creates a certain paradigm for that animal. And that's a cat, that's this. And we're humans, right? And so there's boxes and there's boxes on top of boxes. It's almost like a warehouse where we're stacking boxes almost. It's a natural human tendency. But to deconstruct these boxes is the hope of this podcast today, Chris. And let's just start it off flat. There's only one consciousness. There's only one. Um, in modern times, they use God, but the thing is that word gets, I feel, dribbled down a lot. It's watered down. But there's only one intelligence. There's one consciousness. There's one God, let's say, and that's the universe. That is the universe. God is not a man. And for my followers out there, I've talked about this before, either on my YouTube or my post. God is not an up there, a man sitting with a beard, just barking out orders and creating things and saying, okay, these is humans are the highest level of intelligence. That's not what's happening. Um, Meditation is something that allows us to deconstruct these boxes and remain at a neutral level so we can access ourselves into that deeper consciousness that exists. Now, that's a very simple way of putting it, Chris. We're going to go really deep into it, but I just want to hear what you have to say about, obviously, the comment I made about there being one consciousness, and even that's disputable to some extent depending on who you ask. But just what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, so that's, kind of what the whole mission and message behind Woke and Waking Up is this idea that we are all one consciousness, one awareness, one divine entity experiencing itself subjectively through different bodies and different means. And I think what you touched on about this idea that meditation allows us to kind of start to realize that is something that uh, I think I've personally experienced, but I think it happens with meditation. I think what ends up happening when you start dabbling with meditation is you're kind of in this unconscious cycle. You're kind of just going around, following your needs, kind of just in this blur of doing day-to-day things, waking up, chasing your need to eat, then chasing your need to get your stuff done, then chasing your need to validate yourself, chasing your need, and you're constantly trying to push away these uncomfortable feelings. And with meditation, what ends up happening is you're allowed it creates a separation. It allows you to fall back and watch what is happening. So instead of being the desire of hunger, you can sit back and you can watch it. Instead of being your thoughts and following that trail, you can sit back and watch your thoughts arise. And in that creation of this space in between your thoughts, you start conceptualizing that, okay, my identity, what I think I am, doesn't really exist like I think it does. My identity is just a concept. What I really am is the observer. What I am is this awareness that is watching these sensations happen, watching these thoughts arise. And sometimes we get wrapped up in these thoughts, and sometimes we get extremely emotional and angry. And it's just this unconscious cycle that happens to us. But I think meditation is a way to begin to start unwinding these, I want to say they're momentums of energies in a way. Start unwinding these unconscious cycles of constantly needing to fulfill something, constantly placing yourself in the future of one day I'm going to make it, or one day I'm going to have the money and that's going to make me happy, or one day I'm going to have this relationship and that's going to make me happy. And it's allowing yourself to deconstruct that as well and place yourself into the present moment. And that's where you really start to build this sense of presence and this sense of peace and the sense of security. And that security, I think, in relative terms to what Jesus was talking about in the Bible is this idea of building your foundation of your home on sand or rock, right? Have you heard this story? It's basically the story that he was talking about. If you're going to build a home, you should build it on a foundation of solid stone, because if you build it on sand, it's going to fall away. And what he was trying to get across as his point in this moment is, if you're going to build your sense of security on ego and false attachments and constantly desire seeking, you are not going to be happy, and you're going to keep slipping, and you're going to keep slipping, and it's a very vicious cycle. But if you build your sense of identity on this awareness of, I am this universal consciousness, even though that is the ego in a way, still getting in between you and that universal consciousness, but trying to identify as that pure awareness, completely submerging yourself into that being of that pure awareness. I think that is one of the goals of meditation. And like what you were talking about earlier with this conceptualization, when we project our previous understandings of something, such as a dog or such as a tree, once we've seen a tree, we categorize what a tree looks like. And so now whenever we see a tree, we know, obviously, okay, that's a tree. We are losing our sense of direct experience when we do that, because it's being filtered through our mind. And something that Eckhart Tolle talks about is this moment right before we are able to, right before we conceptualize what is happening, before we rationalize in our minds that that is a tree, that is a dog, we have this, it's a very brief moment where we can just observe what is happening and take it in as direct experience. And slowly but surely, that is, another goal of meditation. What it's trying to do is just bring you into that present moment and just allow you to be here, be now, not needing to be anywhere else, not fearing the past, not worrying about the future. And so I think that is, it's a beautiful statement what you had made, that we are one consciousness, we are one awareness. You and I are both this same thing, having a conversation right now, experiencing itself through different bodies, and everyone watching right now is this same awareness participating in this game. And it's I don't know too much about Hinduism, but it's this idea that there are so many different faces to this same Brahman, this same Godhead, this same, the Atman, the true self. And it's just, we have this true self that's just observing everything, and we're all just playing these roles, we're playing these little games with ourselves. But it makes me wonder, why is it that as a universal consciousness we would want ourselves to be awake? Why would we want to know this? Why would we not want to be unconscious and hidden and getting lost in these games all the time? Why is it that we are kind of going through this global awakening process right now? It's something that's hard to grasp and hard to understand, but it's definitely happening.
Look, there was one time in class, we were reviewing the chapters that we were for the class, because there's obviously a curriculum. And I remember in the whole class, in one portion of the classes, within like the first 20 minutes of class, I raised my hand and I gave like a 3-minute synopsis of the 3 chapters we were supposed to review. And then my teacher looked at me and said, "Are you serious, man? Did you just do that on purpose? You kind of destroyed the whole lecture." I feel like I feel like in this case, you just kind of destroyed the whole lecture, but in a good way, Not destroy is probably not the best word,
Yes.
but yes, you get what I'm saying. And so there's so many levels that I want to touch on there. Holy cow. First one is the identity part. And we'll get to the other ones as we come along. I'm actually going to write it down
man.
here.
Let's go.
Yeah. So, so the identity, right? A lot of times in psychology, and depending on the theories, they always talk about it's important to find an identity. It's important to find what you're good at and all these things, right? But when they use the word identity, so for example, if I use the words, I'm a Hispanic male who lives in the United States, who's very family oriented, a professional that is heterosexual. I'm without someone realizing, they're literally forming 6 identities at that moment. And those 6 identities is something that by them saying and them thinking about it and identifying with this thought and these identities, they're living it. And it happens in an unconscious manner as to what our belief of being an American, Hispanic, male, who's a professional, and I forgot the other ones I said because obviously I don't always form these identities, it's funny. I've seen people, they identify so hard with a group, and there's been studies done of this. This isn't something I've only seen, but they identify so hard with a group that even when that group starts doing malicious things or actions to hurt others, they'll go with the group because of how strong that identity they formed with that group, either based on past experiences or the bonds within that group. And that's just one example. Now, you immediately touched on how sometimes these identities can blind us from this higher level of consciousness because consciousness has no identity. And that's very, very interesting. Now I'm going to ask you a personal question. Have you ever found yourself trapped in this box where you form an identity, you're identifying with this identity really hard, and then all of a sudden, at some point down the line, you realize, wait a minute, what am I doing? So sorry for the personal question, Chris, but promised you I was going to ask some good questions, and here they go, man.
Yeah, I have the first thing that comes to mind. Am I allowed to cuss on your podcast?
I think Spotify does like this thing, so just like if you want to just use the first word,
Okay.
letter.
Yeah, so basically, I think something that I have really begun uncovering in these past couple years is this identity of being a D-bag or being an F-boy. You know what I'm saying? I think that I was somebody who was chasing the women, the cars, the money, and I had this identity of who I thought I was. And I kept hearing over and over again how people who are extremely wealthy and rich were committing suicide, like Robin Williams. That was a big one. There were people who are extremely depressed. You saw somebody who I've really, followed a lot is Russell Brand, and his path of spirituality. But he was somebody who had it all, and he was somebody who I aspired to be. He was somebody who was extremely flirtatious with women. He could get pretty much any woman he wanted to. He had a bunch of money. It was all about the sex, the drugs, the money. And at one point, and I think this is a lot of young adolescent men have this fantasy of becoming that identity, of becoming this alpha male, quote unquote, whatever that means today, alpha male kind of harem of women identity. And I started realizing every time I would kind of go down this path of starting to, treat girls in a bad way or start to acquire money and realize that it wasn't necessarily what I'd wanted. And I always had a sense of wanting more and wanting more and wanting different. That's when I really started to get extremely depressed. And I think what ends up happening with our identities is in our brain on a neurological level, we have our identity is just a bunch of neurons firing in the same pattern over and over again. It's just this constant feedback of this is who I am, this is who I am, this is who I am. And when we finally realize I don't want this identity anymore, we have to begin to deconstruct and literally kill those connections until we finally get to the root assumption and the root identity again. And once we've done that, then we have to begin rebuilding our identity. And so I think for me, something obviously that I've discovered as an identity of mine is that construct of whatever, modern day toxic masculinity is. And I think that in itself is another controversial topic. But that for me is an identity that I have begun to detach myself from. And it's a process. You don't just flip a switch on and off with an identity. There's a momentum to your identity, and there's a process of literally having to kill off this part of yourself. And it's painful. And I think the reason it's painful is because your body doesn't want to have to go through this again. Your body doesn't want to have to go through the experience of having to rebuild neural connections. And so it makes it a painful process on its way down so that you are less likely to make that same mistake again.
To deconstruct to reconstruct again is almost what you're saying. And I had a very similar experience because, in high school I used to wear size 34 Dickies. I mean, it was crazy. I mean, it was ridiculous. And I will never forget how a year and a half later I was at my friend's house. I'm not going to say what the details were that night or anything like that on this podcast, but I will say that around 4 o'clock in the morning I remember looking in the mirror. Obviously you could narrate the details if you want, Chris, but and for the audience out there, but I was looking in the mirror and I remember looking at my friend wearing the Echo shirt and the South Pole jeans and all this crap. I mean, honestly, now I call it crap. I mean, and I looked at my friend and I was like, I don't want to do this anymore. And it was at the time, obviously looking, I look back, I didn't understand what I said. All I said was I didn't want to be this person. This wasn't who I was. But now looking back, what it was is I had identified as this wannabe thug or all this stuff, this pawhead and stuff. And I just realized at that moment that's not what I wanted to do. And I had to deconstruct that identity to then build on what has contributed to Psych Life. And honestly, having that identity before contributed to this. So it's funny how the forces work, but and the sequences, how they transpire. But yes, man, and you pin that on the spot when you say that sometimes we have to deconstruct to reconstruct again. And I think that's important for people to realize out there, because if we don't deconstruct to reconstruct, then we're building and continue building on this sand that you were talking about, that I think Jesus one time quoted. And the sand can shift. There can be what's it called, a high tide coming in that changes the form of the sand. A bunch of things can happen, and if we don't have a solid foundation on our identity, then it becomes tricky. And we can easily take this turn, Chris, to stuff that's happening in today's age, but there's so much, and I want to stick to the meditation slash spirituality portion. And I'm very sorry I mentioned the word spirituality. I know that term has been watered down. I know that term, just like meditation has been something, or mindfulness has been something that just gets thrown out there nowadays. Oh, I'm a mindfulness therapist, but pay attention to every single emotion you have, okay? And I mean, I find that ridiculous. I find that ridiculous. And I actually had a message the other day of someone saying they disagreed with my caption regarding that, because I do write about this a lot. So you mentioned about, I think it doesn't matter who mentioned it, but the higher level of consciousness and how we fit boxes for things. And I'm going to go back to that. And that's part of identities, the boxes that we form for ourselves that entrap us, and we must deconstruct to reconstruct. But to deconstruct or to view life through logic only, I think is the biggest mistake people make, right? To view life through the lens of belief, it's the biggest mistake people make. It's one thing to know that tree across the street, I'm in a 7th floor building, Chris, right now, so that's why I say across the street. But it's one thing to know that a tree is breathing. It's one thing to know that plant is growing, and the tree's breathing what I'm breathing in, and when I'm breathing out, that tree is breathing. If that tree wasn't there, things would, who knows, what would be different. If there wasn't any trees in this neighborhood, would I still breathe as good? All these things. It's one thing to logically reason that, but it's another thing to actually experience it. And that's what you mentioned, the word experience it. How do you think meditation helps us transfer from that logic realm of knowing, hey, that tree's breathing and I'm breathing it in, to actually experience it and giving back?
Yeah, it's a difficult task to constantly submerge yourself in the moment. And our brains are constantly thinking. Our brains are not only conditioned, but biologically driven to be constantly creating thoughts, because that's how we've survived, as a primal species for so long. And it's how our brains work. We are constantly putting things into categories. We are constantly making assumptions based off these categories. We're making assumptions that this means this, so that means that, so that means that. And that's how our brains are working with those neural collection on connections. And I think what meditation does is it's almost like we have, the way I envision it is we have like this energy inside of us that's constantly releasing. And every time it releases, it's like a new thought, a new surge of something, whether it's anxiety or whether it's a thought about, you know, a loved one or whatever it may or may not be. We have this constant surge that's happening. It's like on a loop. It feels like it releases something and all of a sudden you have a thought and that thought will take you off somewhere else. And I think what meditation does is it, instead of allowing that energy to kind of just sporadically start jumping around all over the place, it allows you to pull it back and sit with it for a second and just kind of bring your energy into a centered state, and allows you to, it doesn't feel as sporadic in a meditative state. And what is happening on a scientific level is your brain is literally switching through modes. You know, you're switching in from beta state into alpha state into theta. And in that theta state, your brain is in a different kind of consciousness. You're experiencing a different brain wave. Your brain is moving at a lot slower wave. And in that state of mind, our body is not in the state of needing to be constantly thinking, in a state of survival, in a state of sporadic energy. It's in a state of, okay, we can rest now. It's almost like a dog taking a nap, you know, it's like they're not thinking all the time. And when they take a nap, they actually take a nap. They're actually going to sleep. They're actually resting and healing. Whereas with us, sometimes our brains are just stuck in this high caffeinated, high, you know, induced state, and we don't enter into that healing theta state. And meditation is a way for us to just kind of settle into that and bring on rest and healing for our bodies. And I think that's kind of how it allows us to calm ourselves.
So I appreciate that, by the way, Chris. So in the 70s, there was a scientist that was being funded by the U.S. to test. You know what? Let me start this over. We have millions of cannabinoid receptors in the brain, millions, and in the 1970s, they wanted to find out why. And they did experiments on cannabis and experiments on cannabis. This one researcher, and the US government was giving him 32 keys of cannabis a year to do this research. All right. And he kept trying to, to find out information as to why is this? Why do we have these cannabinoid receptors? How can cannabis help us reach this higher level of consciousness? There was actually, if you look in I'm gonna have to send you this research, and the audience out there, if you guys request it. I was actually reading it the other day, and they were actually funding him for 8 years. 8 years, nothing happened. He went in front and he said, look, there has been some advancements, but I don't have conclusions. Okay, so Israel started funding him. They liked this American researcher. They liked the work that he was doing. They continued to give him 32 keys of cannabis a year. And they ended up finding out that there was that actually he ended up finding out that we do have millions of cannabis receptors in the brain. He was the one who found that out. That was the conclusion of his research. Like, we do have these receptors. And so they transferred this he didn't have answers as to why. He just did the research, right? He's not going to form the conclusions. They transferred it to the anthropologist. They transferred it to the psychologist. I think the anthropologist said that maybe everybody was getting stoned back then, because it's obviously an evolutionary component involved into why we have these cannabinoids, millions of cannabinoid receptors in our brain. And they were like, oh, maybe everybody was getting stoned back then. And they ended up finding out, then the neurologist came and said exactly what we know now. And he was ahead of his time, because now by this time it was the late 80s. His research started in the early 70s. By this time it was the late 80s. And the neurologist said, and this neurologist was obviously ahead of his time, I mean, by a lot. And he said that our bodies release chemicals based on our experiences and the experiences before us, and different chemicals are released in the brain. Now, Hinduism uses yoga synonymous with meditation, almost like if meditation is part of the practice when it comes to yoga. And just so the audience knows out there, yoga meditation has been around, written, not in our language, obviously, in the Hindu language for over 5,000 years. That's when the first scriptures are written, and they include meditation. So obviously, these guys know what they're talking about. It's been 5,000 years. And in here in Westernized society, meditation was just a popular word about 30, 40 years ago. So with that being said, Chris, do you think that meditation allows us, and by the way, for the audience out there, if you want to learn more specifically on meditation or actually practice it, check out Chris's YouTube channel called Woke and Waking Up. All right. And we're going to put the link down here on this podcast. But Chris, do you feel like meditation is almost an access into a certain state of mind that we all crave, that we all want, that we all desire, but we tend to use cheat codes in our daily life, such as alcohol, cannabis, or any other drug use, or even sometimes, going to prayer on every Sunday morning, because obviously we're in the Western side of the world, Catholic, Christian religion, almost seeking something more. What do you think about that?
Well, it's interesting you say that, because meditation is a way to achieve, I don't even want to call it a desired state. It's a way of putting us into the state of being that we naturally are. And it's a weird concept to think that our natural state of being is the feelings of love and the feelings of joy and happiness and free flowing energy. Just because we've been so conditioned throughout our lives to be kind of addicted in cycles of anxiety or in cycles of depression, it's almost scary to leave that comfort zone of my anxiety, of my depression, and allow yourself to just feel into this natural state of being. But I do think that meditation is a way for us to access this state of just allowing the moment, because that's really all it is. That's all it is doing, and that's all we're really trying to achieve. We're all chasing this high of being in the moment. It's like, not only are we just biologically driven for it, but we're also spiritually driven for it, emotionally driven for it. We're driven to be in communion with the universe. We're driven to be in communion with being at one, completely immersed in whatever we're doing. And it's meditation is a way for us to access this flow state, of being completely submerged into whatever we're doing. Um, it's just it's interesting to think that pretty much everything that we experience, we bring onto ourselves. We, talk ourselves into worrying about things. We take things so seriously all the time. Like, we take our individual lives so seriously. Our ego just loves getting wrapped up in, it's all about me. It's all about, what can I get and how can I survive? But our natural state of being is a place of abundance and a place of acceptance and gratitude, and just being at, peace with who we really are, in a state of security, in a state of validation. You don't need anything. You don't need anyone to tell you what's right and what's wrong. You don't need anybody's validation. You don't need security from material gains. You don't need a significant other to make you feel loved. You're able to begin to produce those feelings on your own. And I think a lot of us use relationships or money or whatever it may be as conduits to try and feel into this and get a little taste of it, but it's fleeting. It's not a deep well of this feeling.
To substitute um the higher level of consciousness that we desire with drugs, with this desire of money, to find it in relationships, And that's why relationships, a lot of time, the divorce rate is so high. People always attribute it to the rise of social media, the rise of cell phones, the rise of how easy it is to get divorce papers nowadays. I mean, I think the process is even online now. And I'm sorry, I'm laughing about that audience. It's not that, I'm not saying if you've had a divorce out there or anything. I'm just saying that because the way you put it in meditation is almost like a way of dissolving the invisible walls that our unconscious mind has built, and dissolving these invisible walls we talked about earlier are the identities we form about ourselves that we don't even know that we've formed, but they're there and we're living them. And so I'm going to read you a couple quotes, Chris, by what I call spiritual leaders on this world. I don't even think anybody can dispute that there are the spiritual leaders in this world. But what they may dispute is if spirituality even exists. But if it does exist, for the sake of that type of logic, these are the spiritual leaders. Okay. So I'm going to read you one. All right. And you tell me what you think. The Dalai Lama. Every 8-year old in the world is if the every 8-year old in the world is taught meditation, we will eliminate violence from the world within our generation. The Dalai Lama. So the Dalai Lama is obviously a big time um, spiritual leader. And just for the audience out there, the Dalai Lama is someone who's reincarnated amongst generations. And already China has gotten a hold of the section where the Dalai Lama, the next Dalai Lama, is supposed to come about. He is reincarnated after his death. And the Chinese government has already gotten hold of that section and is waiting for the next Dalai Lama once he passes away. Just so the audience out there gets an understanding of how deep this goes. This goes beyond anything you've ever heard if you were living in westernized society and probably most likely listening to this podcast from this Western world. Chris, what do you think about that? Because to me, when he says that quote, it's almost like he understands that every child is if they can learn how to access this higher level of consciousness that exists, this one intelligence, this one God, this one consciousness, if they learn how to harness this, then they would naturally be in a more blissful state, and they wouldn't be being filling themselves with jealousy, anger, and all these emotions that I feel are carried out now in Western society. And people, like I said earlier, are using them as signals to what's really true. What are your thoughts on that? And like I said, man, these are some, I think they're interesting questions, but I know they're probably toughies, you know?
No, I love it, man. So I think that obviously the Dalai Lama is pretty much spot on with anything he says, but what he's if you deconstruct that quote, what he's really saying is that if obviously if we introduce meditation into the education system, people are going to have more of a chance to really figure out for themselves what is and what isn't important. But people aren't going to inflict anger and suffering onto another individual unless they are truly suffering themselves. You're not going to wish that somebody else is in pain unless you're feeling pain. Or, you're not going to be a hater online if you're doing well in your life. So it's like you're not going to inflict suffering onto another individual unless you're feeling suffering inside of yourself. And I think we are headed in a direction that meditation, I would say within the next 10 years, will become mainstream. It'll enter into the business world. It's already entering into the college systems. You can take meditation courses. There's a bunch of clubs for it. I think this is going to be a mainstream activity. And I think in 10 years, if you don't meditate, you're going to be outside of the loop. Um, I do think we are headed towards a trajectory where we introduce meditation into the schools. And I think allowing and teaching children emotional guidance systems is only going to help out with future generations. And that's what the Dalai Lama is trying to say in this quotation, is that if we teach children how to love themselves, how to watch their emotions, how to calm themselves down, then they're not going to be acting on impulse. They're not going to be constantly, taking out their agitation on another individual. They're going to be more understanding of how things work. And so I think that's kind of what he was trying to say when we deconstruct that. I do think meditation is going to enter into our school system. I think we have a huge seed that is planted right now in society, in Western culture, and over the course of our lifetime, we're just going to watch this thing grow.
Okay. The, you know why I love that. I'm hopeful that that happens because it looks like more people are getting into meditation. And here's the only issue I find with that, Chris. And now I'm going completely off the script now, but this is the only issue I find with that. I feel like everything in westernized culture becomes so politicized, and they haven't even included, and I have another podcast episode about this with Boss of Your Own Brain. They haven't even included in the schools like a social class, like a class where everyone's mandated to take, where they understand their bodies, they understand their feelings, they understand how to operate this. I mean, we, you and I right now talking, we're within the most highly complicated organism on this planet. We are the most highly complicated organism on this planet. It's a miracle. What's that this body is a miracle. It really is, and they're not even teaching kids how to learn how to use this body. They're not teaching kids how to probably how to process their emotions, their mental health. And now, it's wishful thinking to think they're going to add meditation on top of that. But I hope they do. I'm not discrediting that. I hope they do, because meditation is almost a way to access that higher level of consciousness. And I keep using that, and I hope I don't throw my audience off, because this is the first time I've ever done this, Chris, by the way, where I bring in someone to talk about meditation and this spiritual realm.
Well, then define that. Define what you mean by higher consciousness. What does that mean?
So that means we as humans think that for a long time we thought we were the center of the universe, and we even picture God, even in especially Christian culture, because I want to say right now, growing up, I was the one doing the collections at the church willingly. No one forced me. I mean, and it's very, very wishful thinking to think that God is a man with a beard sitting up there. Earth is part of a solar system, and the solar system is part of the galaxy. And there are more grains of sand on this Earth than galaxies themselves. So the universe is beyond our reasoning, it is beyond our understanding. And for me, meditation, when I say the word consciousness, it is synonymous with intelligence, and it is synonymous with God. It is this higher realm that everything that we give meaning to, I'm sorry to burst everybody's bubble, isn't really that important. It really is not. And meditation is for me to access that energy without filling myself up with my own psychological dramas. And psychological dramas include identity, and it includes the things I find important, and all that stuff. So when I say the word consciousness, that's what it means. And it might throw my audience off because I've never done this before, but I thought it was important because I do meditate. And the day, if I go, let's say a week or week and a half, I've done it before without meditating, without reading in my book, I start feeling off. I start getting angrier quicker. I start snapping at people quicker. And that's what I mean by higher level of consciousness. Is this the same consciousness that, and maybe we should ask this in the beginning of the podcast, but that you're talking about when you say consciousness, Chris?
Yeah, so when I think of higher consciousness, and that is another, convoluted term that we hear today, but basically, in the most simplest terms, that I can put it is higher consciousness just means a deeper level of understanding, just a higher level of awareness. And it's so interesting to think about because ever since the separation between the rational mind and the church in the Western culture in, you know, the 1500s or wherever, we started really diving into scientific theory. We had this separation of if the church isn't right, then the only thing right is scientific truth, scientific rationality. This is the only thing that is legitimate and worth grasping onto. And it has created this material world that we only live in a 3D world, and this is all there is, and there's no magic to the universe, and we have laws of physics, and everything's supposed to happen a certain way. And in doing that, we have removed the magic of the universe. We have removed the assumption that, wait a second, it is so much easier for no universe to exist at all than for any of this to be here. Like, what is this? What is this? What is reality? What is experience? What is the universe doing here in the first place? It's like, if you go down into subatomic particles, below atoms, below subatomic particles, below quarks, you just have pure energy. You know, it's just pure cosmic energy. And that sounds so woo-woo, but that scientifically is what it is. And science is finally on the verge of catching up to what spiritual teachers have been teaching for so long. And in one of my favorite books, The Self-Aware Universe, Amit Goswami, what's his name? Goswami.
Show that book there. Show that book there.
Yeah. Oh, where'd it go? It's all marked up here. Sorry.
I'm gonna have to
The
get a
Self-Aware
copy of
Universe,
that.
right here. Probably backwards. Amit Goswami. He discusses and uses particle physics to show that consciousness is at the basis of the universe. That for however long we've had this scientific rational thought, we have made the assumption that consciousness arises out of the universe through a biological and cellular system, that somehow consciousness arises. And what he argues is that consciousness is at the basis of everything. Consciousness is what the universe is created out of. It's not the universe is there in an object that exists and is then creating consciousness. It's the other way around. And we're in that transition of thinking as a large scientific community, turning that revolution. And I think that that is really the next notch we have in scientific theory, because the further down we go, the further we realize that this entire universe doesn't make sense. We have atoms, which are basically 99.99% space, which compose things that you can feel. I can feel, you know, my phone. I can feel and interact with things that are basically 100% space. And at the very end of it, the smaller and smaller you get, maybe it's just an infinite loop of things getting smaller and smaller, but eventually you would enter into this place of space, of just absolute nothingness, of just pure awareness. And I think that's the awareness that we experience as the observer, looking through all of, you know, the quirks, the subatomic particles, the atoms, the submolecules, the molecules, the cells, the, you know, gross experience that we have, gross meaning large. It just blows me away, man. That's all I can say.
Bro, dude, I appreciate that, man, because hence the word space for space. And when you ask me what consciousness is, it's unfortunate because, listen, man, even I, you know, we're having this conversation at 8:30, 9 o'clock. I don't even know. I lost track of time, 9 p.m. Eastern. But this when I wake up tomorrow, I have to come back to earth, and I have to all of a sudden find myself engaging with other human beings who are earth centric, who are only seeing things through the ego, through the identities, through other therapists telling me that the emotions are signs of what is true, right? Like I'm sorry, I laugh at that every time because it's ridiculous. And I have to work with these people. And so, I just want to make sure that the audience and yourself, and honestly, I appreciate you, Chris, for this conversation. I haven't had a conversation like this in a while because it's obvious why I keep these things kind of on the down low. But the cosmos is so big. I'm not going to be even try to comprehend it because I can't. And it's so big that I'm a fool not to notice the miracle before me, which is it's even a miracle, even more, not only that I'm alive, but that I can even talk to you and you're all the way in Chicago. And it just goes on with the miracle of this existence. Now, I know we're running out of time, Chris, because I told you we were going to do this for an hour, but I have a couple quotes here that that obviously I just wanted to touch on with you, man, because this is some cool stuff. Let me start off with a Sadhguru quote because I already did a Dalai Lama one. Okay, so he wrote here, these are his words exactly. The divine is insane. Just look at human beings, the grasshoppers, the elephants, and the whole cosmos. Could a sane mind be capable of all this? And this is quote unquote, and end of quote. And it kind of goes with what we were saying. That's why I mentioned it. But he's basically saying that it's 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 funny to him when people try and rationalize existence, such as the elephants, the dogs, that dog should be in a cage, this should be over here, because no one can comprehend this existence, and people don't really want to dive in deep because it's easy to touch on the surface of things and just stick to these identities and our own psychological drama. And I go like this because our psychological drama tends to continue to circle around our head. It's easy to do that, but it's hard to break away from that psychological drama. That doesn't mean I don't have things going on in my life. For the person listening, you don't have things going on if you have a husband or wife, kids and stuff. Those things are real. But we must always remember that there is something bigger out there. We are part of something bigger. We belong to something bigger, not just some small group, but something way bigger. And if we understand this through this type of cosmic lens, then we will get a natural sense of belonging as a species. And we won't have to necessarily destroy the planet the way we do. So, what are your thoughts on this quote, Chris? And I know we're running out of time, man, because I told you an hour, but bear with me here because I feel like this is a really good podcast, bro.
Yeah, no worries. So I think to loop this back to the beginning of our conversation, when we conceptualize something, the insanity of the universe, when we conceptualize a grasshopper or a dog or whatever it may be, we have immediately stripped it of its magical qualities and placed it in our heads as a construct to fit a mold. And we lose the process, the direct experience of watching this. And as Alan Watts would put this, a tree isn't a tree, it's treeing. It's a verb. It's being a tree. And when you observe that more closely, we look at a tree and we look at another tree and they're, fairly similar to us. But on a deeper level, what this is it's a self-replicating organism that just so happens to look like a tree to us because we've categorized it. And I think that it's insane that we do that because it strips out the beauty and the magic of the universe. It makes everything fit into a box. And in doing that, you strip it of its pure essence. And in not seeing it for what it is at the deepest level, which is another part of the universe, which on an even deeper level is another part of you. It's you experiencing yourself as a tree, you know? But we can't conceptualize that because our identity and our ego traps us into this you and I construct, and we have this illusion, this sense of separateness, and we can't experience anything outside of our bodies in a way. It's
That's myself. I wrote this in my notes. Myself is a psychological boundary that's been set up, and when we put myself, we're separating ourselves from the tree, when really without it I can't exist. When we talk about the bird, we're separating the bird from the tree, and really it's they need each other. And I'm pretty sure that's where you're going with it. And I appreciate this so much, man, because this has been a conversation I haven't had since I think my undergraduate years, man. And it's nice to know. And it's nice to know that there's people out there like you, Chris, who see the light and they see that there's something bigger. There's no need. We all have groups that we naturally belong. We're not trying to escape our species and our needs and our instincts and whatnot. But there are groups that we naturally belong to, like our families and whatnot. But we're always part of something bigger. And people have a tough time grasping that, because when they look next to them and they look to the right, then they see someone that has something more, and they start focusing on what that person has or doesn't have, or who's better, who's stronger, when really they're already part of something bigger. That materialistic object doesn't really mean too much when you realize and become part of this bigger cosmos identity, let's put it, I guess. With that being said, everybody, I'm not saying not to strive for your dreams. I'm pretty sure Chris is not saying that if you want money, you want to be an
oh,
entrepreneur,
after
you
it,
want to be,
yeah.
yeah. I mean, do it, but it's just a talk about the cosmos and originally meditation. And I'm gonna remind everybody right now, if you do enjoy meditating, I found Chris through his YouTube channel at Woke and Waking Up, and I really enjoyed it. He has some honestly what I consider pro level meditation type styles. um let's call them sessions. Let's call them sessions.
Okay.
But
Yeah,
Chris,
I like it.
I'm gonna I was gonna say something, but it's sessions. It really is, and it works because I used one of them, and I really appreciate it, Chris, for what you do, man, because you're putting it out there for free. So Chris, do you want to share any last words for the audience out there, man? You've been an awesome guest, bro. You really touched on some subjects that I wasn't even prepared to go that deep in with you, but you obviously know your stuff. You were ready, and man, thanks so much, bro. But just go ahead. Do you have any last word for the audience out there?
Yeah, just keep an open mind and think for yourself. Don't let anyone tell you what's right or wrong.
Well, I
Love it.
appreciate that, man. And definitely I'm gonna think for myself, bro, because if I would have focused on um social media type of thinking, I would have never found you, bro. And that's because when we talk about social media type of thinking, I'm looking at who has the most followers and all this, but it's always the 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 hidden gems that I'm looking for. And you are a hidden gem, bro. And if you keep doing what you're doing, man, sky's the limit for you. And thanks so much for what you do on YouTube. And thanks so much for being who you are, and continue to spread that positive energy. Even your presence is a positive energy itself, bro. And I really appreciate that, man. And I hope you're not a stranger on this podcast moving forward. All right.
All right, man. Thank you so much. It's been such an honor to be on this.
No,
I really appreciate what you're doing. So thank
no,
you.
no problem, man. And thanks, audience out there, to all the psych lifers. This day is Wednesday night. I plan to put this up by tomorrow. And don't forget, our Friday, our self-reflection journals coming out. And I appreciate all of you guys. All right. And take care. And as always, psych life and peace out, Chris.
Peace.